Hello everyone, today we talk about expansion and conflict in the Italian communes of the Consular era. I realize we're speaking often about the Italian communes, but mostly from a theoretical point of view. This video is, part of the new series that I started about the Holy Roman Empire, essentially, and we will get a bit more in detail, but I plan properly of making videos about single Italian city-states at some point, because I realized that it's getting too much, kind of abstract in a sense, and there is really too much to tell for, let's say, indulging still in this style of narrative, let's say, because certain things are really amazing. And we already talked about the consular era, right, in the Italian communes. That is properly the first one of communal history. The consuls were to magistrates whose council fundamentally monopolized the political and social control of the city. The consuls were elected from the military families, so these large clans that were not just about war, but they led it. They led the communal army into battle, and they were properly in this military men, in the sense of the militia, the militia, that we will have to talk about a bit more in detail. And it is important to stress that albeit these were properly military clans, within them, right, there were many different, crafts, and especially the most important ones, like jurists, notaries. These were the great landowner classes, right, that were by normal standards. Today we will talk about fundamentally the 12th century, right? Those in charge in medieval society and reflecting their preeminence in the city, in the countryside, also because of the knights, of the mounted elite that fundamentally invested in war and contributed to the expansion of the same commune, reinvesting in it, also they properly in the agricultural, for example, specialized cultivations in long-reach trade. And this class had formed gradually between the 11th and the 12th century, and historiographically speaking, we can say that they had managed fundamentally, and especially considering 13th century history, when instead it's the people that will take over, but still fundamentally paralleling the same kind of hierarchical structures, the same consular regime had presented. They had fundamentally managed to maintain a common direction of the commune. This is the moment of not of greatest expansion, quantitatively speaking, but still the 12th century is the moment of great boom of economy, of demographic growth, and this is changing deeply the same urban society that already presented, because of this reason, some internal conflict, right? That this time is not just an internal thing. This is the century of the clash against Frederick Barbarossa, the creation of the Lombard League. This is properly a warlike society, and this is rarely stressed very often in medieval warfare studies when talking about Western Europe, that Italy had basically the highest rate of belligerence of the whole continent, and this is something which cannot but be connected with this impetuous growth that would bring these cities, unlike any other in Europe, to fundamentally create a statal system. Right, other cities, if you pick the Flemish, they're fundamentally towns, right? There is a rich bourgeoisie invested in trade, and that's basically it. The city-states are really states that is within them. There is all. There is elsewhere we can find the knightly class. There is merchants. There are the lower workers. There is an enormous capitalization. This and great part of it is invested in war, in conflict in general, because this such a speedy enrichment would naturally make people invest, and there were many here, and especially concentrated in the city ever more, right, as we will see. Bet on different horses. and this bringing naturally to divisions that had already been present at the moment of the creation of the commune, because not all the elites pre-existing the commune agreed about its construction, right? And that's why we haven't talked enough about how the whole mechanism worked. And this is particularly important also relatively to the relation between the city and the countryside, because in the Italian countryside had always been connected to the city. That is to say, the rural elites could not simply disregard what was happening in town, let's say, in the markets. They invested there. That's how fundamentally the process had begun, right? The same cities had always had an elite. The same historically, also the feudal elite had always kind of ruled from the city. Right, that was the center. This is typical of Italy in a sense for medieval times. In other countries, it was not quite like that. So this brought, given also the concentration of wealth and population, to a much easier struggle. Right, not just between the various cities, but also within the same countryside. That at this point, we made some videos about this, but the city had not quite subdued yet, right? It had started to do so, and that's basically the main reason why also Frederick Barbarossa had intervened in Italy, aside from the fact that the Romans had kicked out the Pope from the city. But it was chiefly about Milan expanding in the countryside, subjugating fundamentally the nobility there, and also beginning to bully other neighboring cities that at that point were, as you understand, still favorable to the idea of keeping things in the status quo. But let's say it was unfeasible, and this is why such conflictuality began to emerge radically, but also within the same city, right? So today we talk about this a little. Because all this, you see, went in parallel with the need of new institutions and new forms of exercise of and control of political power, right? At this point, right, the statal process, we've said, mostly emerges from the end of the 12th century onwards, right? Here, it's basically still some clans, right, and not just a few ones, because always remember that the military class in Italy was distinguished by dreaded inclusivity, essentially taking in all those who could afford a knightly lifestyle, right, and military training, and enough resources properly to lead that kind of properly of menage, and also from a clientele point of view, etc. Well, in the 12th century, there are new classes that rise very fast, and that the Militias at some point will not be able to integrate anymore, right? And there will be a kind of a lock by the end of the 12th century, but still, with in different dynamics that had to do importantly also with the wars of the Lombard League, first in the 12th century with Frederick I, and eventually with Frederick II in the beginning of the 13th, that marked the stage of the rise of the people, and also of the importance of commoners and their infantry in battle, right? And we made a video about the Italian Communes army organization. We will have to come back on that, because that's also quite overlooked development historically. Also for the following developments, but it's properly the military root of the Italian commune that is somewhat overlooked. That is, the commune had been born fundamentally for the sake of common defense, right? All the citizens had the privilege and the duty to be free in arms, right? That's another thing which is an exception actually at this point in history, because in other countries normally non-noblemen were disarmed, right? Or at least were under, the nobility that still kind of organized the great part of their properly combat readiness in a sense, or however keep them under in a way that in Italy instead was taking very disturbing dimensions from a strictly feudal point of view. That's fundamentally what the Germans of Barbarossa wouldn't understand. How could a community of known noblemen, right, that had created itself fundamentally out of the scratch, right, could be able to dictate rule to the nobility on the countryside, for example. So it's that's impressive, right? And so the need of regulation of conflict is what eventually brings to the consolidation of more, of statal institutions on the long run. This is a great lesson in civilization. If you wonder even just why the land became the cradle of humanism or the Renaissance, is because, in terms of, strictly political, military, juridical, administrative practice, these systems were on the lead, right? Properly in terms of public culture, which in a feudal reality is somewhat very difficult to boost, so much that, the same Barbarossa would be quite a fan of the Bolognese revival of Roman law, because that was the deal, right? A lay authority was being reaffirmed properly from as a source of its own law, right, in a public sense. And it was these lands that had pioneered the thing, not the others. But there would be so much to say more. In any case, the other obvious element of conflict is not just, it's not a class struggle, cannot be interpreted like that, at least not only. Here we're talking about an ever large and more complex urban society. And different groups, but also sometimes within them, the different individuals had different interests that could enter in conflict one with the other. So the same need of pacification that the consuls themselves had posed the foundation of their own power can be understood only in a warlike society, such as the Italian urban one of the 12th century was, for many reasons. So keep this in mind, right? Remember how the consular regime here also monopolized basically the command of the communal army, and how properly on the field this is the century where infantry is going under, right? It's not that it's not growing in absolute terms, but in relative terms, the weight of cavalry is greater, right? So this is a moment in which the elites are somewhat, and it's not surprising, actually Italy at this point had the best infantries around, so probably the balance in taking the European average is kind of different, right? But still, there was exactly for this reason, a greater pressure, because it's as if you had two blocks that were squeezing each other for the control of an ever greater amount of wealth, right? That forced the attrition in this sense. So, as we were saying before, the clash that had been lived in the generation living between the 11th and the 12th century had opposed supporters and adversaries of the consular institution. And it had not disappeared at all in the later generations, right? Also because, as we've seen, the countryside were still and would never be fully brought under communal control, right? So there was always somebody that could say, wait a minute, right? Even with a deep intersection, as we've seen with urban policy, because it was basically the same thing, right? It just depended on who could also achieve power in the city and how, right? Great landowners, etc. And naturally, given that during the 12th century, the process of the communal, of the expansion of the communal jurisdiction on the district, on the countryside, brought to further conflict, right? As we were saying before, the city, normally, what was this like? Kind of in central and northern Italy, there were roughly, like 30 more important centers that corresponded almost always to the older district and diocese of Roman origin, right? So these were countersigns that spanned for just a few tens of kilometers, one from the other. So think even just from a strategical point of view, how important that is, right? The enemy is not, the enemy is everywhere, as we understand intersectionally here. It's not a geopolitical matter, but still, when city fight against other city, the distances are 1 day, 2 days of march to one from the other. So think in terms also of the broader militarization of these societies, what this practically meant. And look at also their urban architecture, right? These were fortified cities. They were full of towers. The palaces were built in stone. There was a massive also compaction proper of these, right? Because lots of people lived within them, and it was properly from the sake of military defense. There are astonishing stories at this point, right? Bishops bringing, catapults in the gardens of private citizens to bombard the towers of their rival. We are at these levels of intensity, so there is a gradual extension of the communal authority on the district as such, that was in parallel. Technically, the communal one had made its own, somewhat usurped what had been the one of the bishop counts, right? That had developed at least officially in the 10th century. In practice, bishops had always had an important role in the government of the Italian cities since the early Middle Ages. But in the 12th century, there is also a great evolution and deep evolution of urban society, as we were saying before. And we're talking chiefly about a quantitative growth that can help properly to understand how much interest gravitated around these transformations. One of the data that historians have used to calculate the growth of the city population is being constituted by the gradual widening of the urban surface that emerges from the comparison with the later wall rings. And almost in all the Italian cities are reconstructible 3 wall rings. The smaller one is older than the 12th century. Some are also the Roman ones, right? The second one is exactly in the 12th. Other great moment of expansion. Eventually, there is the third one that is planned and began between the 13th and the 14th century. It is the largest, sometimes not even accomplished because it was the great, like cathedrals, right? They were started, then eventually the crisis of the mid-14th century arrived, and in Europe, like we finished medieval cathedrals in the 19th century sometimes. Well, so that's the dynamic. But just to now we will give some concrete physical data to understand it better. It's a massive expansion. So according to certain calculations in Florence, for example, the older ring finished by 1078 surrounded a surface of 37 hectares. The second, accomplished between 1172 and 1175, incorporates 97. And the third, of the period 1284-1333, 430. Right? So we passed basically 10 times more and more, actually. So it is not completely correct to establish a perfect link between the expansion of the wall rings and the increase in population, because the density of the habitations was not uniform, right? Sometimes the new rings were to surround areas were already inhabited, while in other cases they were made comprising still empty areas, right? You know how the thing had happened. Basically, with the urban expansion, there was the original ring, and suburbs began to be built around it, especially in correspondence to the major gates with the major roads that arrived to the city. So in times of war, all these suburbs were exposed. Of course, there were ditches, palisades, things like that. But if you can afford a stone wall, that's better. So they incorporated this. But normally, even within the older city, there were areas that were deliberately left, empty. Right, there were sometimes even forests within the same cities. There were, free areas. In part, some spaces were organized for, encamping troops during siege, having enough surface to properly have an army within the city to defend it. There were market areas where, they had to take the cattle and let it stay. And also, properly, they were essentially projecting the eventual population growth to say, okay, let's make the next ring large enough so that if population keeps increasing, there will be enough space for a while. That way we don't have to make yet another one, right? But in spite of these considerations, the urban population grew, and how much it grew in the frame of a general increase that also invested the countryside. The 12th century is a moment of generalized growth, and as any pre-industrial system, still the city depended on the countryside, right? These cities existed in the first place historically because the countryside was rich enough to make the surplus being accumulated somewhere, right? And naturally, the citizens controlled the countryside, right? Normally, the various sectors of the city had, from outside of their corresponding side of the walls, their possessions, right? And there were very important conflicts, for example, stemming from, from which side do we have to expand, right? The city that lays east or the one that lays west, because that would have properly also damaged different sections of the city itself, different neighborhoods. So you understand how complicated things could get, and also our capacity for reconstruction from a historical point of view. But the 12th century, especially, is not, it's normally not all what we would like to know. But these are also basically the best documented areas in Europe to start becoming, especially with all the chronicle production, etc. That these areas are spontaneous, are not paid by someone, right? Like in other countries, these are written by people who lived there and saw things and had, they had to have a public reliability in a sense. They were not inventing it. Doesn't matter if they were biased, everybody was, but there is a huge difference whether you're, a clerk who was paid by a king to write his own story the way he was, and, a guy that wants to point out something about the life of the city, where he basically doesn't have to respond to a specific. He's not being commissioned that yet. That's why the 12th, the 13th century, the early 14th century are very important in Italian historiography, because you can see there properly something that comparably doesn't exist in other areas of Europe. Eventually, with the rise of seigneuries, things started to be instead more like, still thriving in many ways, but still there was a lord there, and often these people at least saw things from their window anymore, not directly from the city council or from the battlefield, or and this is important to stress. So according to certain estimates, cities of average dimensions, such as Vercelli, Pisa, or Padua, in this period had their population multiplied respectively by 2, 3, or 4, right? So the number of inhabitants passed from some thousands to tens of thousands. In the first place, for the migration in the city of inhabitants of the countryside, which is normally where we see these enormous rates of population growth in pre-industrial times. It's not because people began to copulate like rabbits. It's just they literally moved in the city, right? Which naturally tells you how much wealth gravitated around that, and so much that the average peasant could arrive there and make a living. And still, by the 12th century, it wasn't even particularly exploited in the process. And by the 13th century, there is a much greater consolidated hierarchy and statal apparatus, so that you see basically proletarians living of subsistency life as labor workers in the major textile industries and masses, things like that. At this point, right, somebody could move from the countryside, go live in the city, and even acquiring some importance with business, with trade, crafts, and so on. Right. So this movement brought to the coexistence within the city walls of families of different origins and traditions, clienteles and groups that found in the new amalgam the possibility to unhinge themselves from the old relations and to sow new ones, right? Because of this, in the Italian cities of the 12th century, there are the first attestations of groups united by common interest that tend to support such interests against other groups. And it's important to stress that at this time, the traces of an institutionalization of the neighborhood relations are very rare, right? Albeit, we already know that they were there, right? They were quite important, especially from a military point of view, because since the end of the 9th century, the guard duties for the defense of the city walls were organized topographically within the urban space. So remember that this is a community in arms, right? The consular class is still in charge, but the middle classes contribute to the army. They have their own arms and armor at home. They produce them. Also for the knights, the whole system works together. So this is a very interesting, because every change reflects on the rest of the community. There are, however, the first attestations of corporations, right, of guilds that united individuals dedicated to the same profession. For example, in the Piacenza Cathedral, built around the mid-12th century, every column is decorated by a relief that represents an artisan at work, right? And among the others, there are a shoemaker, a cloth merchant, a tanner, a baker, a dyer. These figures were sculpted to remember the craftsmen groups that had provided the money for the purchase of the columns. Think about that. So before, there had been crafts associations promoted from the same political authority to control from the top the supplies of goods and services necessary to the court and the city, right? That was quite important because the city has one main issue, but to get enough food for all the people who live within that. The Italian city-states will have, basically at the moment of their greater expansion, the same amount of inhabitants living in the countryside, right? So it was imperative, like in other times in history, right? In Roman times it was the same thing, that at least the access to grain supplies was controlled by the commune, right? And this is interesting because, as we've seen, the commune here was led by multiple clans, right? There wasn't a sole centralized authority, right? It was an important central one by medieval standards, but still all these provisions depended on the same local production, the craftsmen, and these people increasing their relative political weight accordingly ask for more political prerogatives, right? And what is fascinating, what happens in the 12th century is thus that the new societies came to be constituted from this lower strata, from the same workers that united through an oath to organize the work and to help each other reciprocally against internal competition and the pressure of other social groups. And obviously, the capacity to constitute these sworn associations depended also on the internal strength relations of the city community. For example, in Pisa, in Genoa, cities the economy of which was founded principally on long-distance trade, it is precocious the presence of merchant consuls. That is, a magistracy that in the name seems to constitute, as we could say, a commune within the commune. According to a mechanism of imitation that will be typical also the following centuries, that basically the people will do similar things on its own, and generally speaking, this is how medieval communities tended to organize in the first place, with different colleges, councils, regulations, magistrates, and so on. And in these examples, it's meaningful that the merchants specifically had such. Consider the merchants here with the word great armorers. They provide, they supply all the, for example, the ships, materials for war, for the shipbuilding, for and the same, they were invested in the same trade. They invested the goods, the resource. So it's a meaningful thing to see properly a consulship of merchants within the same commune there. So to the social tensions that crossed the communal society at the end of its phase of settling, because this is properly the moment in which the commune takes a definite form, right? It's a gradual process. There are what is interesting about the Italian communes is that they started appearing more or less in the same years, and changes in their institutional system basically occurred in parallel to all cities, also witnessing how dramatically interconnected they were, right, across the whole region. But at the same time, was we don't have to see the foundation of the commune as the equates state, as we've seen. This was a very gradual process. It was a settlement of different institutions, regulations, administrative apparatus, etc., that came to consolidate in an ever more rational and orderly form, right? And it's very important to stress that Italian communes consolidated as such properly in the period in which the clash between the communes themselves and Frederick I began, right? At this point, the consulship had fully affirmed itself. There were also those policies that supported families and individuals belonging to the same levels of prestige and wealth, that added further cohesion within at least the same groups. So the confrontation with the empire reproposed all the, let's say, background questions on which the commune had been born, right? Basically just a bit more than half of a century before, right? That is to say, for example, the framing of the cities within the political system of the Kingdom of Italy, the power of the communes on the territory, on the district, and beyond, by the way, because some were beginning to expand, Milan specifically, on also, threatening other cities, and their political and administrative autonomy, right? Let's remember that these years had fundamentally seen an eclipse of imperial authority in Italy, and that the commune itself was kind of an anomaly, right? It was going by the book in a certain sense, essentially assuming, as we've seen, that comital episcopal authority on the district, etc., were acting on its behalf, etc., but at the same time was something radically innovative that nobody had ever quite disciplined properly from the top, right? So also that's why what the emperor could claim at that point relatively to these communes' prerogatives. Furthermore, became quickly a fought one, right? Right, immediately. So this also tells you what was at stake there and what was the capacity. It was either pro or against the emperor. So you had to also, communitarily speaking, respond to that. But in the rare cases that we managed to follow, thanks to the documentation for a single city, right, which citizens decided to support the empire and which ones decided to fight it, we find ourselves in front of amazing data that show us how the 12th century urban society had become politically complex, right? And in fact, not only for the empire, cited not only those who could draw benefits from a restored Italic kingdom, nor the empire was fought by all those citizens that in their family didn't have traditions of exercise of public offices. This is particularly important, as you understand, because it shows from one side that there were people who were already understanding the importance of the autonomy of such cities independently from the imperial legitimization. And equally, there were people who instead thought that their rights would have better, served by essentially a sovereign authority that could leave them kind of freer within the same city. But what eventually the moral forces were to side on the long run, right? This was especially true at the beginning of the clash, but fundamentally Frederick I alienated from the imperial cause most of the same cities, even the ones that had previously called him, right, to actually stamp the expansionism of others, etc. So certainly, how it is witnessed by Milanese and Bolognese examples, the people that remained loyal to the empire against the decision of the communal government to adhere to the Lombard League were actually sent away from the consular college, right? Properly out of the city, even in some instances, but they would come back still at the end of the war, right? In such a way that the conflicts opened within the era of Frederick I were to constitute the basis for further internal clashes in the following decades, right? And this is important because they wouldn't forget what had happened, right? And still, especially after the Peace of Constance that sanctioned the communal freedom, there was a further boom, demographically, economically speaking, right? That put at the service of such communities new forces to spend in the political competition. All right, so for today we really stop here, and we will continue naturally to talk about these things in detail, referencing also to single cities. And I realized basically we never made a video on things like the clash of the emperor against the Lombard League or things like that. We made, I think, a video about Frederick I and Frederick II, almost kind of by as a kind of biography fundamentally of the two, but it was just extempore, right? But we have to do something more systematic about this era and starting to go really in detail in ways that I realize at this speed it's a bit difficult to do. So, but we'll think some. After all, I'm choosing topics randomly, as you know. So we will come to cover basically everything about medieval warfare. But I started recently this series on the Holy Roman Empire exactly to give the right space to this specific realities in Italy, in Germany, etc., to to stress certain aspects that I think are very important in a modern European perspective, because much of what eventually the world lived it does pass through these countries in ways that are often overlooked, right? Especially from a strictly modern perspective, right? A modernistic perspective, at least, and that instead do not have to be overlooked at all. Also, properly to get an idea of what civic education and democratic culture actually are, which seems to me that we have never fully known, right? It's a myth that World War II cancelled, brought to people a new idea of democracy. They know shit. Let's be honest about that. It's as if basically nothing had happened, and even if the important changes occur, still, these are easily being reversed. So we need to make a massive effort properly to recognize that there is a huge problem in the way we have looked at history, and that until it's not realized, people will never properly learn from, and that's an enormous issue. It's as if the wave was too big to be stemmed in the first place, and we have to build this dam to stand it in a way or another. Otherwise, we will be overwhelmed, right? So that's also why we make these videos, and never think that even topics, presumably this doesn't sound so, but many others, even somewhat kind of more specific in nature, do not fit this plan, this purpose, right? Because as we know from a Clausewitzian perspective, you can not basically understand the world if you lack an understanding of politics, of war, and society, right? If you take away one, the thing doesn't work. There's a huge, like 1/3 of of the world understanding basically goes away, and just for the sake of an essential and balanced view, by the way. So I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.